So now when we start in, now that we've gone over what entropy is and what chaos is, and what it means to be ordered, at least in general, let's take a look at John and Dave, and then later Mary, and see what kind of conversation they're having together. They talk about NASA and looking at finding life off planet, finding life on Mars, let's say, or finding life on a planet that finding life on a planet where that has all the conditions that are very similar to Earth, right? So you might think, oxygen. You might think like the distance from the sun, so it's not too hot, not too cold. What they like to call the Goldilocks. The Goldilocks, right? Zone. The area, the space, and you get just the right amount of light, not too, and you have the Earth, the planet spinning at just the right speed, so life could exist. Well, we imagine life could exist as it does here on Earth. But could life have evolved? Could you have life? These systems that create order from disorder, could they exist in areas that are not like Earth? So everything on Earth is very similar. Even a jellyfish, if you start to look at its pieces and parts, are very similar to other life on Earth. They do things differently, sure. They look differently at the grander scale. Sure, an elephant doesn't look like a wolf. A bird looks different from a dog. But when we look at the details, all life on Earth is very similar because of how it developed. The conditions on planet Earth require, right, that you be able to exchange the gas oxygen, for instance, or get rid of carbon dioxide, or so you have to have some kind of exchange mechanism. Insects, for instance, use little tunnels in their exoskeleton to allow air to flow through their bodies. They don't have lungs like humans do. Whales have lungs, humans have lungs, but fish have gills because they're taking the oxygen out of water, not out of air. So it's not taking gases out of air, another gas, it's taking a gas, oxygen, out of water. So you need a special structure. But still, the cells are very similar. Could you have life on a planet that's very different? And if you did, it would probably look a lot different from life on Earth, life that we find on Earth. So how could we, if we're looking for a definition of life, and if we're going to look for life on other planets, we need to have a definition. That's like the entire crux of this whole section here. If we need a definition of life. It has to, then we have to understand that life on Earth is due to the conditions that we find on Earth. So if we find another planet that maybe doesn't have carbon, a lot of accessible carbon, maybe they use silicon. Maybe on another planet they don't use oxygen. They might use they don't use iron. They might use cyanide as their oxygen grabber. Maybe they don't use oxygen at all. We just don't know. So they might look incredibly different from us, as you see from all the alien movies. But when we look at life on Earth and we start to define it, we have some incidental. Incidental means that incidental result means that our life on Earth is how we define it because of the fact that we live on planet Earth and all the conditions that are defined by that, right? 24 hours a day, seasons, cold, heat, water, all the things that define Earth make life, require life to adapt to those things. So I hope it's clear that when you think of life on Earth, you're thinking of life that has adapted to this environment, to this planet. So if you're on another planet, life might look a lot different. But still, we should be able to identify it as life. So here in this part of the conversation, Mary starts to look at an example of the difficulty of defining life as we see it here on Earth. And that's that, and she uses a taxi cab example. When I was a kid, all taxis were yellow in New York. So taxi is yellow. In fact, they used to call them yellow cabs. So all taxis are yellow. And the city mandates that they be yellow because for whatever reason. So if you said to someone in that city, a taxi, they would say the color is yellow. A taxi is yellow. The taxi is yellow. But in other cities, there could be a different color, and they may not recognize it as a taxi. Okay, of course, today we have Ubers, and as you can tell, it's very difficult to use that definition at all with an Uber because, Ubers can be anything. They're not yellow. So we would be very much in this, if we were trying to define life on planet Earth or on other planets in terms of Earth, we'd be in this taxi dilemma. We would be trying to define life as we see it back home, but it might be different wherever we're looking. We might see, in the case of a taxi, an Uber, and not know it was basically the same function as a taxi. Some of you might not even know what a taxi is. So in any case, life on Earth has to be defined a little more generally than life in general has to be defined based on its basic properties and not so much what we see here on planet Earth, if we're going to be looking for life on other planets. Then this whole conversation here starts talking about how we might define life as being in between birth and death. So in between there is life, they say. Probably a little too general. And I would argue that you're alive before birth. So not sure that's a great definition. Regardless, it's not sufficient. Even if it works, which it doesn't, for various reasons, it's not very good. Then down here, they say life is more of a process and less of a system. Then they talk about fire. Fire is not alive, but it does use up oxygen and make carbon dioxide just like we do, but it's not alive. And they start, so let's talk about this. This is really an important little, John makes an important comment, something we already defined in class, actually. The properties of living things. Living things grow from within. We talked about that. Mountains grow, but they grow from outside. They grow by layering matter. We actually process matter and grow from within. That's what life does. They metabolize. Life metabolizes, so that's what we call processes. Energy and matter. So in some way, life has to take in energy and use it for its functions so it can move or do the things it does. And in some way, it has to be able to manage the amount of matter it has in order to grow, in order to live, in order to replace itself, to correct itself, to fix itself. Life has to be able to metabolize. It has to be able to reproduce. It has to be able to respond to stimuli. It has to create. It has to be organized, as we've discussed already. And it has to be able to sustain an equilibrium or steady state. A steady state, or something we call homeostasis, using dynamic equilibrium. All right. So living things have to have these kind of characteristics. We know that. We've actually already stated all these. We've worked on most of these you defined in class almost day one. This last one, we worked on it for like a week, right? Homeostasis, dynamic equilibrium, feedback loops. We just got done talking about that. In fact, I should just go ahead and add that down here and say, using feedback loops. Mostly negative feedback loops. Okay. And by the way, where did I get all that? Then that's one of the answers that people ask me about in class. And where did I get all that? Right here. It's all right here. One of the key paragraphs. Next, in the conversation, they start to talk about, well, what about people that have problems? People that, exceptions. What about exceptions of this, of these? Things that are alive but don't have these. So what are some examples of of things that would make this weaken this definition? So a mule or something something's half donkey, half horse, and a mule is sterile. So it cannot reproduce. Does that mean it's not alive? That becomes a problem, doesn't it? Again, these examples are in the reading. Then we could talk about how a thermostat regulates, which we've already talked about, keeps homeostasis, right? A thermostat keeps homeostasis. Is it alive? Computer virus replicates. It copies itself. Does that make a computer virus alive? So these exceptions kind of start to weaken that definition, especially when you're thinking about going to another planet and try to find life on these other planets. And NASA came up with this idea. Well, what about if we define life as a chemical, assume life is chemical in some way, some kind of processing of chemicals. And self-sustaining, and undergoes Darwinian evolution. So the populations adapt to their environment. Okay. What about that? What if we use that as a definition of life? Well, Dave brings up a good point. What if the life isn't chemical? What if it's energy-based life? What if it doesn't use chemicals? What if it's electronic life, AI? What happens if AI ever becomes self-aware? Are these alive? These are questions. I'm not telling you there's an answer, but they're questions that can be asked, and you should think about it. So that's it for page 2. I'm going to stop here and then move on to the next page or next section.